Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons & Dragons 6th edition and the question of whether there should be a future past continuum for 6th edition. Alright, so let's get into this. So first, let's define what a future past continuum is, and then let's answer the question on whether 6th edition of Dungeons & Dragons, the next edition of Dungeons & Dragons, should have a future past continuum. Alright, so let's define a future past continuum. Alright, so right now, quite a few games, a future past continuum is an idea that exists in a few different games, and I'll give you the games, I'll list the games, and that will help you understand the future past continuum. So the first and foremost, the most famous game with a future past continuum, and where it's very, very clear, is Warhammer. So you have Warhammer, that's a fantasy game, right? It's a fantasy tabletop role-playing game. And you have Warhammer 40K, and that is a fantasy tabletop role-playing game, right? Which is a science fiction fantasy tabletop role-playing game, okay? So you have a fantasy game and a science fiction game. One in the past, one in the future. And there is a continuum between the two, right? So the Warhammer fantasy world, far, far, far in the past, right? And then Warhammer 40K, the future of that Warhammer world is 40,000 years later, right? And it has spaceships, and it has laser guns, and it has futuristic tech, right? So that is a future past continuum. It is a continuum where the past of the world presents a continuous line to the future of the world, and there are elements that are shared between them, right? So in Warhammer Fantasy and in Warhammer 40K Sci-Fi, right, one of the binding elements is demons, right? So, by the way, of course, I'm aware, so Warhammer Fantasy is a tabletop role-playing game. Warhammer 40K is a tabletop role-playing game. They are both also miniatures games, miniatures battle games, right? War games, miniature war games, right? But one of the things that's interesting is in the miniatures war game and as well in the tabletop role-playing game, the demon faction, right? The chaos faction, they're all demons, and they're the same. They're exactly the same between Warhammer and Warhammer 40K. They haven't changed, right? They're like, demons were in the past, demons are in the future. You know, like, now, Warhammer 40K also, you know, like I said, it uses spaceships, it uses gene seeds, it uses, you know, bio enhancements, it uses mechanical, you know, almost cyborg equipment. So it's very sci-fi, but there's a continuum, and it continues all the way through. So Warhammer is the absolute archetypical future past continuum for a tabletop role-playing game. There are others, all right? So very, very recently, Pathfinder. So Pathfinder fantasy game, Starfinder science fiction game, right? And they are connected. Those worlds are connected, right? And so there are threads that go from the history game, you know, the past game, the fantasy game of Pathfinder that connect all the way to Starfinder. And also, this particular game really shows the potential of a future past continuum, right? So Starfinder did very, very well for Paizo, right? It sold pretty well. And here's one of the biggest reasons you could tell that game is doing well. If you walk into a Barnes & Noble right now, it is the last remaining large-scale book publisher, bookstore chains in America, you will find Starfinder on the shelf in virtually every Barnes & Nobles. That's a big deal, right? That's a big deal. That is absolutely a signal of success today, is that your game has the juice to stay on the shelves at Barnes & Nobles. Dungeons & Dragons has that juice. Zweihander's out there at a few shops, right? And Paizo, you know, Pathfinder is still on the shelves at Barnes & Nobles. That's not an easy trick for tabletop role-playing games anymore, because you need to print in thousands to get into Barnes & Nobles. You need a print run of at least 10,000 in a significant hardback, right? And very, very few games today have that. Like Symbaroum, you can't buy Symbaroum in a Barnes & Noble, right? You can't. It's a great game. It's incredibly well constructed, You can't get it. And Modifius is still Modifius. They're an international publisher. They make tremendous games. They're one of the best in the business. They have real momentum. They're a real business, and they can't get their games on shelves in Barnes & Noble. It's a big deal, right? All right. So Starfinder did well for Paizo, right? And so you have Pathfinder to Starfinder. And that points to the fact that this can be lucrative for a tabletop role-playing game, because now you have two core rulebooks, you have two games, right? Both which are interconnected, and when players go from one to the other, they feel comfortable and they feel welcomed and they feel familiar, right? It's very, very, very distinct benefits from a future past continuum, right? There's more games than that, right? So you have Pathfinder, you have Warhammer, right? Another one is Shadowrun. Shadowrun is the science fiction future game, and its past game, its fantasy analog, is Earth Dawn. That is a very specific, connected, future past continuum for a tabletop role-playing game. Now, my favorite example of this is Index Card RPG. I'm a huge fan of Index Card RPG, which is made by Runehammer Games. The key catalyst for that is a gentleman by the name of Brandish Gilhelm. They are executing at a level that no tabletop role-playing game company on the planet is executing. They're really crushing it right now. And their continuum, their official canon world for Index Card RPG, the fantasy world is Alfheim. The science fiction setting is Warp Shell. Now, in every single example I gave today, these are shared worlds that have a shared history, right? So in Warp Shell with Alfheim, you will find artifacts that are really super high-end. You'll find artifacts in Alfheim in the past, in the fantasy game, that are really super high-end technical devices in Warp Shell, right? Now, this, of course, connects to Arthur C. Clarke's famous saying, which is a significantly advanced technology is indiscernible from magic, right? It's a overused saying today. People say it all the time, and one of the reasons why is it is a very modern fit, right? So we've defined why. Let's start to talk. We've defined the what. We've defined what a future past continuum is. Let's start talking about why. So here's the thing. I do think Dungeons & Dragons should shift in 6th edition to a future past continuum. And let's talk about why. So one of them we've already talked about. This is economically sound, right? So so Dungeons & Dragons can be a fantasy game and a science fiction game. And there can be a through line in the history of both that is consistent and exciting and familiar and profitable, frankly profitable for tabletop role-playing games. And tabletop role-playing games really need to start embracing methods that allow them to be more profitable, because frankly, tabletop role-playing games are one of the absolute worst business models that exists on the planet today. Tabletop role-playing games are wonderful for the users, for the dungeon masters, and for the players. They are terrible, terrible business models for the publishers, right? For a whole host of reasons, right? So anything that allows them in a very organic way, that isn't harming anybody, that isn't breaking any laws, right, to make profit, I think they should really start to embrace that, right? And this is a very organic way, a future past continuum. So with 6th edition, we could introduce, the Dungeons & Dragons fantasy world, right, connects to a Dungeons & Dragons future, right? And there is a continuum between the two of them, right? Just like Warhammer, just like Index Card RPG, just like Pathfinder, and just like Shadowrun, right? This has been done before, and it is helpful for all. None of these properties seem to have suffered from making this choice, right? All right, so let's talk about why. Now, another reason why is, so right now, here's a good reason why, right? Every time you're going to make a major change to Dungeons & Dragons, and this is a change to Dungeons & Dragons, you need to see what Gary Gygax has already said on this topic, right? He is the father of Dungeons & Dragons. He is the progenitor of Dungeons & Dragons, and you cannot make a change to Dungeons & Dragons, a major change, a significant change, without really understanding how this fits with Gary Gygax's vision. Now, that doesn't. Now, you can absolutely make a decision for Dungeons & Dragons that really goes against the vision of Gary Gygax. But you darn well better be doing it with knowledge that you're going against that vision. And if there's a good business reason why, if there's a good social reason why, if there's a good political reason why, if there's a good cultural reason why, go ahead, right? But be knowledgeable that you are breaking the vision of Gary Gygax when you move forward. You need to be knowledgeable of that, right? So that's important. I think that's really key, right? All right, so now one, here's the thing. This absolutely would not break the vision of Gary Gygax. This perfectly fits with the vision of Gary Gygax. Gary Gygax already introduced a future past continuum into Dungeons & Dragons, which has never been fleshed out. It has never been executed, right? Now, do you know it? Can you guess it? Where was the junction point? Where was the junction point where the future past continuum was set into Dungeons & Dragons? All right. Well, it was in 1985, and it was the expedition to Barrier Peak. Okay, so that is the Dungeons & Dragons, the quite famous Dungeons & Dragons module that is now quite famous because it has a spaceship in it. It has a alien spaceship in a Dungeons & Dragons module, right? So that is fully permission from Gary Gygax to go down this road, right? To say, yes, there is a future past continuum for Dungeons & Dragons. So that alien spaceship came from a future we don't know right yet. We haven't really fleshed it out, right? But Dungeons & Dragons 6th edition can do that. It can go down that road. It can begin to flesh that out. It can see the full extent of Gary Gygax's vision, right? And also, just to be clear, it's arguable that Gary Gygax really kind of paved the road for all these other games to be successful on that platform. That he actually made the connection for these specific. He made that connection, right? So that there could be a future past continuum within these tabletop role-playing games. So I think that's really important that we really acknowledge that. It's a big deal, right? So what are some other reasons why they would consider going to a 6th edition, why would taking 6th edition to a future past continuum, right? Well, one of the reasons why is modern sentiment, right? So right now, as it stands right now, Dungeons & Dragons is systematized Tolkien, right? It took Tolkien's work and really systematized it, right? Now there's some issues with that, right? So one, there's debate within the Christian community if Tolkien was actually a Christian, but there's no debate that he absolutely embraced a lot of Christian framework and structure, right? So the Lord of the Rings has a lot of Christian imagery in it, and it has this idea of good and evil that really comes from a Christian framework, right? That there's really no debate on that topic. And also, just so you're aware, like if you're not aware, Tolkien was part of the Inklings, which is part of the author for the Narnia Chronicles, C.S. Lewis, right? And the Inklings there was very major Christian themes through the Inklings, right? All right, so and Tolkien had a pretty robust friendship with C.S. Lewis, right? Who was absolutely a dyed-in-the-wool Christian, right? Like it's like the main theme of his work, right? All right, so here's the thing, right? So I'm an evangelical Christian, right? So it seems antithetical for me to say that there should be a future past continuum, because one of the things that will come with this future past continuum is the fully solidification of, oh, this really isn't magic. This is just unrecognized technology, right? Now, why would I want that in Dungeons & Dragons? Well, the reason I want that in Dungeons & Dragons is, one, my Christian, views of what I would like to be upheld in Christian, what the Christian ideas that I would really like to be upheld in Dungeons & Dragons are already abandoned, right? So the big ones are the Paladin and the Cleric, right? There was a day where, and it was Gary Gygax's vision, and this is one of those areas where Gary Gygax's vision has been fully abandoned, right? There was a day where Gygax's vision was that a Paladin is a noble, good warrior, right? And has divine power, right? And there was also this idea that a cleric was a noble, divine, good healer, right? A noble, good hero that had character, much the way character is displayed within the Holy Bible, the way an evangelical Christian would recognize, right? And that they are given divine power from their good God to heal, right? Both of those have been fully abandoned. They're no longer in Dungeons and Dragons. They started out in like 3rd edition. They're like, oh, you can have an evil paladin. Who cares? Now I'm kind of like, didn't we already have that? Isn't it called a fighter? Right? Like, you know, it's pure nonsense in my opinion, right? And the same thing with the cleric. Oh yeah, you can have an evil cleric, right? Now so basically, the thing I want is already out of Dungeons and Dragons, right? So all we have now is we already are going. Dungeons and Dragons since 3rd edition has been breaking down that Tolkien link as far as politics, culture, and society, right? So basically, there is already the starting of an abandonment of Tolkien, right? So if you are moving away from a Tolkien model, if you're moving away from the idea that deities, divine creatures, are giving good powers, it just fits the modern aesthetic to just say this is just coming from tech. It's just tech you don't understand, right? And like, that's another issue is, so basically, my point is, I don't need Dungeons & Dragons to be my vector for Christianity, right? And it's already starting to break down, but it still has the shape, right? They're still like, oh, let's keep the paladin in, and let's keep the cleric in. And I'm kind of like, do you need to, right? And the reason why is, they don't make any sense anymore anyway, right? So why not shift it to what most people are going to understand and what most people are going to be comfortable with, rather than doing this weird back-ended, like, counterfeit paladin, counterfeit cleric, right? Let's just go all the way and set the game into something that could be profitable, that most people will understand, and is not a weird shoehorn that is, frankly, a bunch of people were really not super comfortable with evangelical thought ideas or Tolkien's Christianity within their Dungeons and Dragons. So rather than trying to keep shoehorning it in, and people who really don't have any concepts of those things anymore anyway, don't even have the language, don't have the structure for it in their head, because none of them have ever, it used to be even like people who weren't evangelical were like dragged to Sunday school. That's all gone, right? So the people who are trying to shoehorn the cleric and the paladin into that view, it's just really clumsy, right? So why continue to do it poorly, right? If you're gonna break Dungeons and Dragons off and away from Tolkien, right, who had very, very significant Christian influences, then let's do it, right? Let's make it tech, because at least that makes sense. Whereas this poor counterfeit doesn't make sense and really isn't comfortable or winsome for anyone, right? So I think that's just a better model, and I think it's definitely a better way to go and a better way to approach, dropping this change in. So all of those are reasons that I think Dungeons & Dragons 6th edition should shift into a future past continuum. I think it'd be more profitable. It would make more sense. A lot more muggles, like just regular people, non-evangelicals, people who are not Christians, it will make a lot more sense. Like, just get rid of paladin and cleric at this point. Like, I think I'd rather have them gone than have this weird counterfeit that they have right now that doesn't make any sense, right? And then start to source magic through tech, right? That makes more sense to the rest of the world rather than this counterfeit version that we have right now. So that's another reason. And then also, it embraces Gygax's original vision of which started with Expedition to the Barrier Peaks. So all those are my reasons for why Dungeons & Dragons 6th edition should shift into a future past continuum. I'd love to hear your opinion. Do you think it should or should not? Let me know in the comments below. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.